There we go. Give me some thumbs up if you can hear me. Just want to make sure people can hear me okay. Or a chat. Good. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Hey, the class shrunk. This happens. As soon as I say that we're going to be recording the class, people decide to do that. That's okay. That doesn't mean we won't have fun, those of us that are here. Let's see. I think I pretty much worked everything out technically, but we'll see how if that changes as we go on. Hold on just a second. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll take it from there. All right, share sound. Okay. We'll do this. Just a second. Yeah, I think this is going to be good. Good. Making it a little bigger. Wow, that's way too big. Okay. Hopefully that's okay. Cool. So let's go over some of the course details. Hopefully you've ordered your book or are about to today. I did post the very first chapter as a PDF to get you reading. So that should keep you busy for the next few days until a copy of your book does come. Again, consider it a required text because there will be questions from the book that won't be covered in lecture or be covered in discussion section, so you will need the book material. Okay, beyond that, we have 2 tests in the class, a midterm and a final. They are not cumulative. But they do cover a lot of material because each half of the course, so there'll be at least 60 multiple choice questions on each of the exam, maybe a little bit more. I believe it's a 2-hour. I still have to figure out details on that, but your first test will be during week 3, and your last test will be during the finals weekend period. You'll have some flexibility as to when you can take that test because you'll be taking it online on your own. It is open book, open notes, open video, but again, it's important you study for the exam. You can't come in cold because you won't have time to look up the answers for every question. There's just no way 2 hours would allow you that type of thing. I should also mention, because it is open book, people tend to do very well on these exams. We end up with a lot of grades in the A range. So that means that, there isn't much of a curve at all. We don't need to add points and that sort of thing like we might have to during the regular quarter where it's a live class and people don't do quite as well, and then we do add a curve. But expect most of your classmates to do very well, which means you should be keeping up with them and make sure you do very well too. Okay, just to remind you, the tests are multiple choice questions. I'll give you some examples of those questions as we approach the first test, and they will be covering the lecture material and then the book and discussion section material as well. That's going to be material that's not overlapping between those 3 sources. All right, let me take a second here to see if there's any questions. Any questions? I'll put them in chat or raise your hand. I assume I'll see hands raised. Okay. All right, then let's continue our discussion from where we left off last class. And we have been talking about echolocation. Here's our slide, our last slide from our previous discussion. Okay. Carla asked a question, no problem. Will we have any assignments or just tests? Just 2 tests. That's it. It's a fast class. It goes by very quickly, and we'll just be having two exams. That's it. Okay. Oh, and there's no extra credit. I think it says that on the syllabus. So, again, it's important you do well. It's important you study. It's an open book test. Again, if you study, I promise you'll do well on the tests and do well on the course. Okay. All right. So we started off talking about this amazing ability of blind individuals and sighted individuals to be able to hear things that don't actually create sound, but actually structure sound. Again, when we think about how we perceive sounds, we're usually referencing things like how we perceive a voice, how we perceive musical instruments, how you perceive somebody clapping, something like that. And yes, we do hear all those things, and those are very important things that your second chapter will cover. But the first chapter covers something that we don't often think about, and that is how we use sound that is structured through reflections, through different sorts of shaping of how the sound occurs after it leaves the sound source and goes into the world. And the most dramatic example we have of that, I think, is our example of someone like Daniel Kish, a blind bike rider who clicks as he's riding his bike to be able to echolocate the sorts of objects that are in front of him or to the side of him. And this is how he navigates the world. And I should mention that Daniel, when he is not riding a bike, does echolocate continually as he's walking around a shopping mall or even his home. He does use a cane as well, but much of the way he's navigating is through the clicking he's doing. His clicks are usually much less conspicuous when he's in a kind of a public place, but he can still notice them, and he's able to use that information. And then we talked a little bit about the type of acoustic information that's useful for echolocating, as well as what we know about these expert echolocators, and that's where we left things off last class. The fact that Daniel Kish, someone like Daniel or his friend Brian Bushway, who've been echolocating for years and years and years, have the ability to determine the location of an object in such a way that it rivals how we do it visually. So what I discussed there is the fact that using this sort of apparatus, it could be determined that he's able to distinguish the position of two sound reflecting discs that are just offset a tiny little amount. 1.2 degrees is, if you think about 180 degrees total, is just a tiny amount, and that does compare favorably to how we would be able to tell if those two discs were set apart visually, which just really is amazing. People are better if they're blind from an early age, but as I said, that's not the only thing that determines this, right? Brian Bushway, as I said, is I think he lost his vision in his teens, mid-teens, and he's able to perform like Daniel, which is amazing. And then we talked about this very important component, this last thing here on the slide, where this research that was done on Daniel and Brian and other blind individuals found that when they echolocate, they're making use of the parts of their brains that for the rest of us are largely devoted to vision. So that's the part back here called the visual cortex. As I said, there's going to be a lot of carryover between these areas in the brain, but historically, I guess we can say to some large degree, much of what we do visually is processed back here. As we said, the visual brain does process auditory information and vice versa. But we can call this the visual cortex for now, safely. And because Brian and Daniel don't have visual input to that part of their brain, that part of their brain is usable for something else. It's like that part of the brain is saying, hey, I've got nothing to do. Can I help out sound? Can I help out touch? Can I help out smell? And there's research on that as well. And, that's what that does. Importantly, and I think this is really interesting, is the second part of what I wrote here, that it is the case that they are accessing the visual areas of their brain when they are echolocating for the purposes of determining the location of something in front of them, whether it's a disc, whether it's a a parked car when they're riding their bikes around their neighborhood. Then they are using the returning click in processing, at least to some degree, in the visual component of their brain. If they're just listening to kind of a disembodied click that is not used for echolocating, they don't bother doing that. They don't bother using the visual aspects of their brain. It seems that the visual involvement of their brain, this visual cortex here, is used when they are trying to determine location, which is interesting and something we're going to be keeping in mind. So this kind of cross-sensory kind of compensation that happens in the brain doesn't just happen kind of haphazardly. It seems targeted at specific skills, which we'll see again and again as we go through our discussion of how the brain compensates for sensory loss and for improving different sorts of skills. Okay, that's where we left off last class. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move to talking about something we haven't discussed very much, and that's the emitted sound that Daniel makes. Okay, so there's the click. I talked about in the experiments we ran in our lab and conducted outside, and other experiments, old experiments, when you bring sighted people in, very often they don't want to click for whatever reason. They'll use another type of sound. They'll say testing 1, 2. They'll make the type of sound I had you make when we were trying to understand ripple, noise, pitch. Remember, kind of what we call a white noise sound, that type of thing, right? All those sounds work well. Okay. So the question is, how important is your sound if you're echolocating? And does it have to be your sound? In other words, think about a scenario where, say, Brian and Daniel are out there mountain biking, right? Is it possible that Daniel could be making it click, but not only Daniel, but Brian can also use the sound reflections that are created based on Daniel's click? Okay? In other words, can you kind of borrow the reflections that are based on somebody else's emitted sound? And the answer is absolutely. Okay, so the very early echolocation experiments, the ones I showed you of these very charming videos of in the 1940s, 1950s, a lot of those experiments ended up testing the importance of the emitted sound. Okay? So you saw videos of people making their own sounds, and in a lot of those videos it was based on the hard sole shoes clicking against the floor, the wooden floor, right? But it turns out that they could actually record those sounds and then have people walk in their stocking feet, so they weren't making the sounds while they were performing the task. But they could still hear, played over loudspeakers in the room, those clicks, okay, the clicks of the shoes. And they found, as long as there is some sound being, emanating from a loudspeaker somewhere in the room, okay, they could still echolocate even though they weren't making the sound at the time. What else? Well, they started then exploring synthetic sound sources. And all of this means synthetic sound sources are sound sources that are made electronically. Probably they weren't using computers back in those early experiments, but they could, create sounds using, different sorts of electronic devices, scopes and stuff like that in the laboratory. And they tested to see if those sounds could be used for echolocation. So sometimes they'd have people wearing little loudspeakers on their chest, or they'd put loudspeakers above where the person was and have that, maybe emit a sound that sounded like a loud tick-tock sound or something like that. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Just created from a, electronic device they had in the lab back then. And they found that, again, yes, people could echolocate based on a sound that was not directly created by them. White noises could be used in the lab. That's a very easy sound to make in the lab. Old radios, probably you haven't experienced this, but if you listen to radio in the car, you're just getting one station after the next. But in the old days, you could tune a station, you could tune between two stations, and it makes that kind of shh sound. Not sure where else you would hear that type of sound. But you probably understand that, it's kind of an interference, kind of a noisy sound that's created electronically. Or tones, whistles that could be created in the lab. I'm not good at whistling here. Okay, something like that could be created in the lab, again, with electronics devices. All of those sounds were useful for echolocating, which is interesting. My dog is trying to get into my garage here, so just give me a second. I'll see if he wants to come in and say hi. Be right back. Nah, he wants to go play with the rest of the family. Sorry about that. I'll bring my doggy in some point. We can all meet him. Anyway, all these sounds were very useful, and this was maybe a little bit surprising, because think about the kind of conceptual kind of model, or the other example we had of echolocation. That was from bats, and bats had been understood for a long time, and had been tested in terms of how they would compare their emitted sound and versus the reflected sound. And in fact, we talked about that being kind of the example to understand how the auditory information could support this sort of behavior, right? A comparison between the sound you're making and then the sound that's returning from a reflecting surface, right? Whether it's returning with a delay, whether it's returning a little bit quieter, it was a comparison. But they realized pretty quickly that you don't need to be making your own sound in order to use sound reflections. Okay? I should mention, talk to Daniel Kish about this, and he'll say that, yeah, he knows this is true, that sometimes he'll be able to sense where a wall is, say, in a shopping mall, or outside if he's walking towards a building or something like that, without making his clicks. Okay? However, he prefers to make clicks if he can, because he can direct the sound in a specific way. But he knows he doesn't need to, and he's still able to do some echolocation. Okay? So here are some nice examples where a sound is heard to leave some sound source to reflect back, and then can be borrowed, basically. But there are even more extreme examples of this. And I'm going to introduce something called ambient sound right now, which you're experiencing right now. I don't know where you're sitting, in your bedroom or in your living room or kitchen or something like that. Maybe you're wearing headphones, but you might want to, if you're wearing earbuds or headphones, you might just want to take them out for a second, just so you can hear the very quiet sounds in your room. I'm hearing there's a fan behind me, a very quiet ceiling fan behind me. That's about it. In fact, you want to know something? I have a seashell up here to remind me to tell you about this. When you were a kid, did your parents used to tell you that you could hear the ocean in a seashell? I always thought this was such a kind of sweet, romantic idea, that you could pick up a conch shell, a big conch shell like this, on the beach, if you could access a conch shell, and you put it up to your ear, and you'd be able to hear the ocean, kind of reflected in the sound shell. Well, I don't want to, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert here. The seashell does not record the ocean sound. You probably knew that. What a seashell does is it kind of captures through its internal structure the ocean's sound and amplify it a little bit. Probably were able to get this when you were a kid, an older kid, right? And you can do this not just with a seashell, you can do it with your hands. Okay? like this. Cup your hands around your ear, and then you close your eyes and maybe open your hands slowly. You can hear almost like an ocean type sound. That's fun. Yeah, I'm having a good time with this right now because I do have a nice fan behind me and it's making a nice shing sound. If I close my eyes, I can also kind of smell the ocean air, smell the sun on me, right? All right, I'm easily amused, I admit it. But why I'm asking you to do this is because what you can do is use your hands here to amplify what's called the ambient sounds in your room. These are the very, very quiet sounds of your room, right? You probably don't typically notice them. We do this in the classroom where we're teaching live, and people don't really think about the quiet sounds that are in the room that are usually coming from ventilation or usually coming from, people kind of shifting their seat a little bit and their clothes rubbing together. I mean, these are super quiet sounds. You can amplify them through this kind of seashell resonance, but that's not why I'm telling you about the ambient sounds, really. It's just a way to hear them. Those sounds, those quiet sounds, have been found to be sufficient to be able to echolocate. Now, these are some amazing experiments, and it works much better with blind children. But what has been found is that just based on those very quiet sounds, blind children could do some navigating using how those quiet sounds were reflected in a room. So they asked the children to take their shoes off. They had carpeting in the room, so they weren't making any loud sounds with their shoes against the floor. And they asked them to be quiet. Now, no clicks, no mouth sounds or clapping or snapping or anything like that. And had them walk around to see what they could determine. And what they found was that, yeah, they could determine if there were obstacles in front of them. 4-foot panels, 6-inch cardboard strips. You don't need to know those details, really. But what's important here is not only did they not need to be making their own sound, they didn't really even have to have any really noticeable sound for the room and the surfaces in the room to structure and reflect the very quiet ambient sounds that were coming out of the vents in the room or some, other kind of very quiet sound source. Somebody moving while they were moving, their pants might have been barely rubbing together. You probably would never notice it without it being pointed out to you. But that amount of sound is sufficient, at least for blind children, to be able to do some navigating. They could also tell, when they were coming up to a corridor, they were then asked to walk along a wall. They would say, okay, here's your wall here. Okay, it's gonna have a couple of corners, but walk against the wall and see if you can do so without hitting it. And they absolutely could do that. So what does this mean? I think the big story here is this notion that echolocation for humans, at least, probably for bats too, but for certainly for humans, is based on a sonar sort of metaphor, a sonar, where I'm making a sound that then comes back to me and I'm comparing the two. Okay? That might be usable, but it's not necessary. When we're echolocating, we do not need to be making sounds. In fact, there need to be very few sounds for our brains to be able to detect sound reflections in a room. Right? And that's going to prove to be a very important component for the film industry, the television industry, the music recording industry, to be concerned with when it comes to the kind of structuring of echoes and reflections to depict those sorts of scenes. So there's a limitation, and there I have Indiana Jones and well, I can't remember his son's name, but there's his son, in a cave. Why do I have that? To remind me to tell you that, in a way, I think a better metaphor for echolocation isn't this, I'm sending out a sound, it's coming back, I'm going to compare them. But it's kind of like being in a cave with a flashlight where there's more than one person. I call it the spelunkers metaphor. You know, here, if you learn nothing else today, spelunkers are people, it's just a silly name for people who explore caves. So imagine going down into a cave and you're there with Indiana Jones, you know, because you're trying to find, you know, one of those things he likes to steal from, a different part of the world to bring back to his museum. And he's got a flashlight, and you got a flashlight, and you're looking around. Of course, he's looking for snakes because he's scared of them. But you're not that scared of snakes, so you're kind of looking for artifacts. And then all of a sudden, his flashlight goes out. His flashlight runs out of batteries. Okay, what's it? Oh, great! And you're looking around. You say, "Oh, that's okay. I've got it. My flashlight's working fine." And Indiana goes, "Just make sure that if you see any snakes, you let me know about it, right?" But Indiana can benefit from the flashlight that you're using in the cave, right? In other words, you have the energy source in your hand. Okay? It is emanating from your flashlight. It is hitting the walls of the cave and whatever else is in there, reflecting back to your eyes. We're talking about vision now and light. It's also reflecting back to Indy, right? It's going to his eyes as well, right? So he can benefit from the energy reflections that you're creating with your flashlight. And that's a way of thinking about echolocation, okay? Indy is using energy reflections that he's not making, that he's not controlling, but he can still use, like echolocation, right? Daniel Kish can tell you, I don't need to be making the sounds. I prefer to make the sounds. And Indy prefers to have the flashlight, right? Because I can direct, and I'm looking at things up in this on the walls and the ceiling, and he goes, can you sometimes just point it down so I can see if there's any snakes? And I'll go, sure, Indy, there's no snakes, don't worry. But Indy would prefer to have a flashlight and prefer to be able to control the emitted light, okay? But he can certainly benefit from the reflected light that my flashlight, that my controlled flashlight is making. So I think that's probably a more accurate way of thinking about echolocation. And as I said, it's going to be a way of thinking about echolocation that's going to be very relevant to the entertainment industry. Because when we're watching film, when we're watching TV, when we're listening to music, we're not making sound that's having an effect on the structure of a scene location. That doesn't mean we're not using sound reflections. In fact, I'm going to argue we're using sound reflections all the time, even though we're not making emitted sound. And that's where we're going to turn to Hollywood for this. Oops. Here we go. Sorry about that. Hearing lessons from Hollywood. Okay, so if you've started to read that first chapter, you know I got a chance to meet and interview a bunch of sound engineers from Hollywood. And boy, was it fun. It really is. You know, it's interesting. I always tell my class this, that these are folks that are very important to, you know, creating entertainment that we love, you know, movies and TV and music, but aren't very often given much kind of recognition. And when you get them talking about what they do, first of all, they are so passionate about what they do. They really love it. They're really interested, and they're really insightful about it. And in fact, I would say to them, you know, you folks have thought about these issues more than science have. And they'd be very surprised. They said, I thought you scientists would know all about, you know, hearing reflected sound. And no, most of us don't study that type of thing. So it was wonderful talking to these folks. And when I talked to these folks, they all said the same thing. They said, so you know what the goal is, say, you know, when we're talking about TV or movies, the goal of the sound engineer is to make sure that the audience feels like they're part of the scene. It kind of makes sense. It's like, when you're watching a movie, as I said, we just watched the Mission Impossible movie on Saturday. My wife and I went to the theater, and what they want you to do is to not be distracted, to feel like, in a sense, you're there with the actors, right? Tom Cruise in this case, that you're there in the room. I mean, you're consciously, that you're watching a movie, you're not in a room with Tom Cruise, right? But part of your brain kind of wants to feel like you're there with the characters in the scene. And that's one of the major goals of these sound engineers, as well as the cameraman. They want you to feel like you're there as much as possible, right? So they want to keep the audience in the scene so that the theater, so that your living room kind of feels like an extension of the space of that scene. So I think at one point he's in a warehouse with the Mission Impossible crew, and his new woman, who is kind of considering joining it, and it takes place in a warehouse that I'm sure was a set on a soundstage somewhere. But the stories about them in a warehouse, I guess where were they? Rome at that point, or maybe Paris. And you're seeing a lot of close-ups of the actors. You're hearing them speak in this warehouse, and the sound engineers, the camera people, the special effects people want you to feel like you're in that room too, even though consciously you're not. They want your kind of maybe lower level brain to kind of feel like you're there with them, so that the theater sounds like the space you're seeing. And in these theaters, they have speakers. I kind of noticed this again. I hadn't been in the theater in a long time, but they have speakers all along the side, and they have speakers in the back, and they have speakers in the front, to help you feel surrounded by the auditory space. And so, yeah, you kind of feel like you are surrounded by the room that's being depicted in the scene. And they want to make sure that does not change. Because any sort of mistake, any sort of distraction can make you aware that you're sitting in a silly theater in the valley, right? And you're not in Paris with Tom Cruise and all these glamorous people. Any glitch can take an audience out. And in the old days, this doesn't happen anymore. Luckily, I was reminded of this when I was watching the movie, or before the movie. After, in between the previews in the movie, they have something on the screen. Please turn off your cell phone. Make sure it's on silent mode and all that sort of thing. And in the early days of cell phones, that kind of kind of implicit rule was not there. So this is before your time, but when people first had cell phones, they kind of really kind of took over a person's life, so they didn't feel comfortable turning them off. Who knows, you could get an important call. And in the early days, people would answer. They would first of all leave the ringer on in the middle of a movie, and then they would answer their phones in the middle of the movie and talk a little bit. And it took a few months for people to kind of say, okay, listen, everybody, we're not going to do this. There was a lot of kind of scolding in theaters when cell phones were first on the market. But now people are generally much better than this, and sometimes you still see people texting and it lights up the room a little bit and stuff, but for the most part it's not too bad. But that is the sort of glitch that can take people out. You folks might be aware of other film glitches, right? They have something called continuity, where if a scene, say the outside scenes were not actually filmed in Paris for Mission Impossible, or filmed in Rome. They were filmed in Toronto because it's much cheaper to film up there. They've got to make all those outside scenes of Toronto, that look like Paris. So if there's too many signs in English rather than French around or something like that, people are going to say, oh, that's not quite right. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, they believe that people are aware of that, and it takes them out of the scene. One of my favorite examples of this is a wonderful old terrible movie. I don't know if you folks enjoy old terrible movies, but this is one of my favorites. It's called Plan 9 from Outer Space. And it was made by a filmmaker named Ed Wood, who was known for just loving to make movies as quickly and as kind of roughly as possible. He didn't care if there were mistakes. That would take the audience out and kind of remind them that they weren't watching two pilots in a movie, but were actually watching two actors on a kind of cheap looking soundstage. Can you see something that would take the audience out there? Yeah, well, besides it looking ridiculously cheap, there's a shadow there of the microphone. And it's one of those films where every scene has something that's conspicuously not of the scene and of the filmmaking process. It's very, very, very conspicuous. Another example of this is how sound can take things out. And that's what we're going to be most interested in as we go through this. And I think the most conspicuous example of this is poorly dubbed films. Now, when I was a kid, there were kind of a genre of films from Japan about monsters, these giant monsters. I loved them when I was a kid. They were, really fun. These are old films that were done in the 60s and I think some in the 70s, probably some even as early as the 50s. But they were done in Japan, and they were not created to be shown in any other country, but they got very popular in America too. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these old movies, but they're pretty charming. Those Godzilla movies. Ultraman, yeah, there we go. Good one. That's a nice example. So yeah, these are really fun movies to watch. But right away, when you see the Japanese actors speaking and you hear the English dubbed onto it, it becomes very conspicuous, especially in these old movies where they really don't put a lot of time and effort into trying to make try to synchronize what's being said with the faces that are speaking. And yeah, there's a great example where you're just very aware that things don't match up. I don't know if you folks watch dub movies now, so certainly there's a lot of really wonderful foreign language shows and movies that you can watch in streaming. Oh God, Bank Heist, is that what it's called? Money Heist, right? Money Heist is out of Spain, I believe. My kids, when they were taking Spanish in high school, watched the Spanish language version and say, "Dad, you're really going to like the show." And my Spanish isn't that good. So I turned on the English version. And when I first turned it on, it was just, English dubbed on Spanish speaking faces. And I can't watch dubbed films, even when it's done much better like it is now. So I'm one to always use the subtitles and just leave the language on its original language. We were just watching, my wife and I were just watching something last night that was partially in Russian, Romanian, and I think German. And yeah, we have to have the subtitles on. We can't watch the dub because it takes us out. And the film sound designers are very aware of this. They prefer, in some ways, I mean, even though you're distracted by watching potentially the subtitles, they would prefer that you're listening to the original soundtrack. Not only is that a situation where you're going to be taken out of the film because of the kind of mismatch between the dialogue, but there are situations in which the room's reflections are potentially going to be distracting. So here's the first lesson from Hollywood, I'll call it. Hollywood has taught us that our brains are very sensitive to how room structure sound. So I talked to an individual named Jay Patterson, and I'll introduce you to him in just a second. I'll show you a picture of him in just a second, who said that it's really critical that when he's filming a scene for either TV or movies, and what he's doing is he's recording the sound, that he do something to make sure that the sound you're hearing, okay, of the room, of the room's reflections, match the scene you're seeing. Okay, so let me show you this. Here, say, is a scene he's going to be filming, and it looks like they're just building their a scene that maybe is in a bedroom or something like that. Okay, so it's going to be a small scene. He worked on he continues to work. I should look to see what his new credits are, but back then he was working on a TV show called Without a Trace. I don't know if reruns are on anymore, but this is back 2009, 2010. It was a rarely popular show then. It was a kind of a standard network TV, investigative police show, Without a Trace. I think it was they dealt with kidnappings and things like that. The police characters, and there were a lot of scenes in offices, a lot of scenes in people's homes, that sort of thing. But most of them were actually created on a soundstage. So there you're seeing a bedroom, say, that's on a soundstage. And the scene would just film, what looked like a small bedroom, but it would be created on a space that was very, very different. The space that scene, that set would be created on might be something like this, which is essentially a warehouse or an airplane hangar. That's actually what's called a sound stage. If you've ever been to the Warner Brothers lot or Universal Studios, maybe. I don't know if the tour shows things like this anymore, but certainly if you get a chance, by the way, these other tours of studios are really, really interesting, especially now that you're all perceptual psychologists. The Warner Brothers tour, I took some friends there recently. It was just wonderful. They tell you about this stuff. So here's the problem, though. Imagine what your voice would sound like in that room, or even your footsteps would sound like in that space, on that sound stage, right? It would basically sound like your voice in a warehouse, in a Costco, probably even worse than in a Costco, right? Clap your hands in a Costco and it goes everywhere and there's a lot of echoes. But this is even a more open space than a Costco. So you talk in this space, you clap your hands, you walk, anything, it's gonna sound like you're in a giant warehouse, even though the scene that's going to be depicted is going to be in a small bedroom. So this is the type of problem that sound mixers, sound recorders need to deal with, right? They need to make the sound space match the visual space. Okay? The depicted scene needs to match the heard scene. So I say here, the depicted scene's acoustics don't match the soundstage acoustics, right? You're seeing that. The depicted scene is going to be a small bedroom, but the soundstage is going to be a warehouse. What they need to do is change the acoustic space. Let's just make sure we have an intuition on this. Here is the soundstage space. Okay, so the sound space acoustics, the sound space sound is going to be very reflective, where the depicted scene is going to be very closed. You know how, when you go into your bedroom, it sounds different than when you go in your garage, right? You clap your hands, you make a sound. Imagine that being even more extreme because you're going from this to this. Right? So what they need to do is come in and change the acoustic space so it then sounds like it should, given what people are going to be looking at in that scene. Right? Does that make sense? And that's where Jay Patterson comes in. He is a sound mixer, meaning he's the one that actually records the sounds of the room. He's going to record the dialogue. He's going to record any sound that's made during the filming of the scene. We'll talk about what happens after this in a few minutes, but he does the initial recording. And what Jay told me is that he's very aware that every space you encounter during your day has its own kind of sound structure, what he called an acoustic signature, right? It's a sound that is going to be kind of specific to that space you're in, whether you're, when you walked into your bedroom or your kitchen or your office to set up your computer so we could have class today, right? You walked into a room that had a different kind of acoustic signature from the room that you came from. Okay? Whether it was your bathroom, whether it was your bedroom or whatever. And your brain is aware of that. Your brain adjusts so it is kind of accommodating that new space with its own acoustic signature. Now, your brain is also expecting an acoustic signature that's going to match what it's saying. You come into where are you now? Your living room, right? And your brain is going to expect a sound structure that's like what a living room looks like, that size. Imagine coming into your living room today and it looks like a living room, but it sounds like an airplane hangar. That would not work. You would be very distracted, especially if that happened on a TV show or a movie. All of a sudden it'd be like, oh, this is not quite right. Jay Patterson has to make sure that those things match. So what he does, he goes into a space. Imagine he's going into that space we just saw on the soundstage, and he walks into the middle of that space and looks around saying, okay, this is going to be a bedroom scene, so we've got to make it sound like a bedroom. And he claps his hands like that. He believes now he can just clap his hands once, and from that clap, know how he needs to change the space so it sounds like it looks. For him, a single hand clap is enough. He's been doing this for so long. Say, okay, we need to change the space, folks. And he's got a bunch of folks that are working for him. Okay, so okay, we need to put something over this space so the sound doesn't go up to the ceiling. The sound is kind of reflected or dampened so it doesn't have those echoes. We need to put things on the side. We need to put things in front and in back of that space so it sounds like it looks. And so they bring in what's called baffles or blankets to modify the space. And he has to do this really pretty quickly, he told me. It's like the hardest part of his job is the pressure under which he has to work, because what they do is they come onto the space, the camera folks are setting up, the lighting folks are setting up. He needs to do this all at the same time. So he has typically no more than an hour to make a very large space sound like a very small space. And the reason he gets paid big money for this, and they do very well. If you're interested in a career that in this, they get very nice. These are, by the way, these are some of those folks that are striking. Of course, they certainly deserve their raises because they work very hard and are very talented. They have very finely tuned ears that know exactly how to kind of reshape an acoustic space so it matches the scene space. Okay, so you say, okay, we need some blankets over here. We need some reflected surfaces over here so it sounds like it's reflecting as if it's a bedroom. And so now we'll be able to take that giant airplane hangar of a soundstage and make it sound like it looks. And now, not only does he have to do that within that hour of preparation, he has to be able to make sure that he's going to be able to record how that space sounds when people are doing their dialogue and moving around that space. So he places microphones all over that space. Okay, we'll talk about microphone placement in a second. Certainly a lot of microphones are put on the actors when they're talking, and there's a microphone that kind of goes between them. But in order to capture how that newly kind of sculpted acoustic space is captured, he has microphones all over the place. He has little tiny microphones he puts on the walls. He has little tiny microphones he puts on the floor. He's got to also make sure all those microphones are not in the way of the actors or in the way of the camera or in the way of the lighting and all that sort of stuff. So he, this is a real talent. He's got to do this all within an hour. And then he's able to capture the space pretty well. And he's very, very good at this. People watch his films now and will take a look and be able to not be distracted about the space, not the auditory space, not matching the visual space. I've got a great example of this. Let's see how we do in time. All right. I think I know what I'll do. I'm not sure this is going to work. So I always bring an example into my live class. I'm not sure it's going to work in here, but where you can hear this is in dub films, even when the dubbing is good. And I will talk about why that's the case. I'm going to try to bring in a video that hopefully will show you that, but I'll do that after the break. Okay, so Jay does his recording. Hopefully he does a really good job and they can use the dialogue. This is, important for the dialogue because they don't want the dialogue to sound like it's spoken in an airplane hangar. They want it to sound like it's spoken in a small space. And typically he does the best he can, and he's an award-winning sound mixer. But you probably know this, especially for film, often for video, they have to redub some of the dialogue. So even these, kind of, English films, certainly the Mission Impossible film I saw on Saturday night, they had to do some of this, where for whatever reason, when they were recording the original scene and the original dialogue, something gets a little garbled, right? So it could be that one of the actors, they've just done a great scene between Tom Cruise and in his Mission Impossible crew. But one of the actors during the scene just kind of garbled one of his lines a little bit. And actors do that all the time, right? So they expect to have to be brought back in to redub that line. Luckily, it's also going to be a line that they're going to speak in English that is easy to match up to the original film. But this happens all the time. And this is where we bring in another person, a person named, in this case, Sandy Berman. There's Sandy. It's a fun guy. He's what's called a sound designer. And what sound designers do is they add all of the sound and modify all of the sound after someone like Jay Patterson, who they call a sound mixer and sound recorder, is done with what he has. So he takes all these recordings, he kind of mixes them together from all these microphones, he mixes all these sounds together and says, I think what we have here is pretty good. I think I captured how the room should sound like given what it looks like. But, at one point, Tom Cruise did, kind of mumble a line that just didn't come out clear enough. I think the audience is going to have trouble understanding what's being said. Sandy, can you bring Tom back in and re-record him? That's what Sandy's job is, among other things. Sandy's going to do other things. Sandy's going to add all the cool sound effects. And I imagine adding the sound effects for a Mission Impossible movie must be a blast because of all the wonderful action scenes and special effects and all the crazy things that Tom Cruise does. I mean, the sounds of those things are often, don't sound like they need to sound so they can be conveyed in the film. So he has to add the sounds of the motorcycles and the cars and the trains and all that sort of thing. But he's also responsible for bringing the actors back and having them redub their lines. So he's responsible for what's called Foley, which is sound effects, right? Adding the car sounds, adding the motorcycle sounds, adding the punching sounds, right? I'm sure you know that when actors are in those fight scenes, those highly choreographed fight scenes, they're not actually punching each other, they're missing. But what gives the sense that the punches are actually connecting is the sound, right? If you've ever turned off the sound while watching a fight scene, you might see it's not very convincing. The camera angles make a difference, but the sound really makes a difference. We can talk about what punch sounds are in just a second, but what I'm more interested in is not the Foley, not the sound effects, but what's called looping. So looping is the entertainment industry's name for redubbing dialogue. Looping, that's what's meant by looping. And I'll tell you why it's looping. It's kind of a silly name for it in some ways, but Tom Cruise is brought back in to the studio, say, and he has to redo his line. What they do is they show Tom the film that they took of him when they were filming the scene, and they show a close-up of his face, and they show him his face saying that line he now has to redub over and over again. So we need to get there before Kittredge does. Kittredge is this kind of quasi evil guy who works with the CIA. Okay. We need to get there before Kittredge does, or there's no hope. There's your line, Tom. Unfortunately, when he said it, he mumbled it a tiny bit, so he needs to say it. So he's seeing himself. He's seeing a giant screen. Actually, we've seen this. It's a giant screen, a close-up of his face, saying, "We need to get there before Kittredge does, or there's no hope. We need to get there before Kittredge does, or there's no hope." So the film is looping. There's your name. And he looks at it, and then in a microphone re-says the line in a way that's clearer, so they can then dub it on to the original film. That's looping. But here's the problem. Not only does he need to say the line like he originally did without the mumble, he needs to make it convincing, so when they add that new recording onto the film, it looks like him saying the line. He needs to say it in a space that sounds like the place it was originally recorded in. Okay? So this is how much they care about this sort of thing. So how do you do that? How do you make this? It's in a studio, Sandy's studio is not that large, it's like maybe a large garage, or no, it's probably a little bigger than that, I guess, because they have a pretty place for a pretty big screen. Maybe it's a 2-story kind of garage-like room. That room is certainly not going to sound exactly like the room that they originally recorded. So okay, Sandy, how do you do this? How do you make it sound like this new line, this newly dubbed line is being said in the same space the scene took place in? So, well, we got lots of ways to do it, and it depends to some degree on how much money I have, how much money the production has. Now, I'm sure in Mission Impossible, if he were to do that, I don't think he has, but if he were to do that, he'd have all the money he needed to do it the way he wanted to do it. But he's, these post-production sound designer folks are going to be doing it for all types of things. So he's worked on, some big productions, but also on some small productions. Like he's done things for, what's a small production show he worked on? Oh, a couple of soap operas. That's maybe you folks aren't as familiar with soap operas as what's on now that's popular, telenovelas, that sort of thing. But it's kind of like, these shows that are on every day, and they're kind of low cost productions, and it's really more about the story than it is any sort of special effects. I don't know if any of your family members ever watched any soap operas, but my grandma did. Anyway, he used to work on those. And they don't have much money. So what he would do, if he needed to have somebody come into his studio and redub, is he would actually, when Jay Patterson was recording from the original set, Jay would do something for Sandy. Jay would make a recording of the room when it was quiet. He would do something called room tone recordings. This is how it works. After he does all the recording for that scene, okay, on the soundstage, so everyone's done with their dialogue for the soap opera, for the telenovela. You say, okay, everyone stand where you are. We need to do room tone, and everyone would stand and be quiet. And he would take out this specialized microphone like this, although I'm sure he records from those other microphones too, but this is what used to be called a room tone recording microphone. Put it in the middle of the room and take a 1-minute recording of silence. Now, that actually is a little bit deceiving, as you now know. No room is ever completely silent. So these ambient sounds we just talked about, the quiet ceiling fan that's behind me right now, the fish tank sounds, right? I'm not a real fish tank, I mean, my God. The quiet ventilation sounds that are in your room, the sounds made as you shuffle around or something like that. Okay, those are quiet room sounds that are going to be emanating from a very quiet source, but are then going to be structured by the room. And that quiet sound source structuring by a room is captured in these recordings. Yeah, if you were to listen to these recordings, you say, this seems to be a recording of nothing. But Sandy knows, and Jay knows, that it actually can be very useful. Because what you can do, when Sandy gets these from Jay, he's going to say, okay, here's the room tone recordings. I can now add that to the dialogue I just re-recorded. I can take that redubbed dialogue, say of Tom Cruise if he's in a soap opera, and add these room tone recordings to it. So it makes it sound a little bit more like that new line that was recorded in the studio sounds like it was in the original space. Okay, that's one way of doing it. What's another way of doing it? So, well, if I got more money, I'll do something a little fancier, actually a lot fancier. I'll take Tom Cruise's recording and I will bring it back to the original space and play it through some speakers in that original space and record it. So it's called worldizing. It's kind of cool and kind of elaborate. I talked to Sandy after he had just finished a film called El Canto. I can't remember. It was. It's not. I guess it's a pretty good movie. I've never seen it. It was. I think there's a animated film called El Canto or something like that. And it's not that. It's it was a film starring Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony, and I guess this is where they met. So if you're a Jennifer Lopez fan, Mark Anthony fan, this is where they met and that ended up dating and marrying from this movie. And I guess it's a movie about a singer that's from Mexico, I believe, and he worked on it. And there was a scene of a wedding, I guess, of the character's wedding, of Mark Anthony's and Jennifer Lopez character's wedding that took place, was actually filmed down in a plaza in Mexico City, I believe. And so they went down there, and it was this beautiful old Mexican plaza. You can imagine how it looked. It had, beautiful, kind of stucco walls to this outside plaza. The ground had, ceramic tiles. He said it was just a beautiful, beautiful place. It was a beautiful scene. The wedding was a beautiful scene. Oh my gosh. Speaking of ambient sounds, here comes my gardener. Sorry about this, everybody. Hopefully you can still hear me, but it's going to be loud in just a second because you're going to hear the leaf blower along with my doggy barking at them. Sorry about this. Okay. I can still talk. I think you can still hear me. Anyway, it was a beautiful scene. They filmed it for a number of days. Someone like Jay Patterson was down there recording it all. But when they got the final recording, it was clear that Jennifer Lopez had one line or maybe a couple of lines that just wasn't clear enough. So Jay thought, okay, we're going to bring Jennifer in and have her watch herself say the dialogue and have her, do this looping so we record her line reading. They did that, and it was very clear that, yeah, she did a great job. She was able to, match up what, her own face saying the dialogue. That was great. But yeah, what they had recorded in his studio didn't have the sound reflections of the original recording. So he did have recordings of room tone, but he said that he didn't think it was real enough. So what he did, he had the money for this, it was a big budget film, is he took the recording of Jennifer's new line for that scene and brought it back down to Mexico City to that plaza to then replay in that space. So they do that. Him and a couple of other guys fly to Mexico City. El Cantante, thank you. It's El Cantante. Thank you very much. Yeah, the movie with Jennifer Lopez. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I guess I haven't seen it, but I guess it's a good movie, and it had a big budget because it allowed Sandy to go back down to that space with some loudspeakers and to re-record the new line reading in that space. So they put a speaker or some loudspeakers in the middle of the plaza, or probably where Jennifer Lopez would have been standing when she said that line. And they then record from a microphone that's a little back from that loudspeaker. And when her line comes out, it's reflected in that space and it is picked up by the microphone. And the sounds that have been structured by the surfaces of that space, the reflections off the ceramic tile, the reflections off the stucco walls and that sort of thing. And I assume it's more than a single line. It's probably a few lines of hers, a few lines of Mark Anthony's. Now they have captured the acoustic space by bringing the original recording literally down to that space. That's what's called worldizing. I said, okay, that seems very elaborate. Do you think it really makes that much of a difference? You don't think that the room tone recordings would have served the same purpose? He goes, no, absolutely not. The room tone recordings add kind of the sound of the room, but they're not going to change how that line reading sounds because it's, there's no reflections that are going to be incorporated into it. So yeah, I would much prefer to do the worldizing. Say, okay, that's great. Is there anything else you do? He said, yeah, we have another few methods. We have something that can be done computationally, meaning that we can change sounds using computers. Okay? That's called convolution, and I don't want you to understand the technical details of this, but remember this name convolution. It's just applying kind of computer change sound to that line reading that's been looped. So what they would do, this is something that actually Jay would do. When, say, someone like Jay Patterson was down in that plaza for El Cantante, for that scene, yes, they would do the recordings there and do room tone recordings and everything, but they would do something else. They'd take tons of photos of that space. And they would do measurements of that space. They would, do very precise measurements of, how far apart the walls were, how high, how high the walls were. This was outdoors, so there was no ceiling. That's fine. But also they would, kind of do really detailed descriptions of the materials that the room was made out of. So, stucco, ceramic. What else would be in there? Well, there's certainly lots of people in there and things like that are going to structure the sound. And then they would give all those measurements and description to Sandy, who had a guy who was a computer sound engineer who would put those into a computer so that when they had the new recording of Jennifer Lopez's line, would actually take that line, take that recording, and put it into the computer so the computer could then shape that sound so it was spoken in a way that sounded like it was back in that space. It's basically a computer simulation of how the space changed the sound. That's what convolution is. A computer simulation of how the space changed the sound. So they would put into the computer, okay, the walls are so far apart. They're made of stucco. The floor is made of ceramic. All these dimensions would be put into the computer program. The computer program would then change how that line recording sounded. And it's pretty effective, he said. Yeah, I like to do that if I can. It's often as good at worldizing, and it's maybe a little bit more accurate depending on how good the program can be. It's a lot of money, takes a lot of time to set up that program, okay? But if we have the money, we'll do it. But his preferred way of doing it is even kind of more time consuming. What he really likes to do to kind of recreate the acoustic space the line reading is done in is actually to rebuild much of the set in his studio. God, Sandy, this is a lot of work, or I mean, does the audience really notice? He goes, I think they do. I really think they do. So before Jennifer comes in and rereads her line, that needs to be looped, that needs to be redubbed. They have, photos of the space. They have, of course, the video of the space or the film of the space. They have all these dimensions that were measured. They have all the description, and they try to rebuild this in his studio. So they will bring in, surfaces that have stucco on them, surfaces that have ceramic on them. They will try to get them roughly in the position, to the degree they can, that the original walls and floor and seats or chairs or whatever else was in that scene, or fountains, maybe, things like that. Of course, they don't have to look. These things don't have to look like they originally did from the scene, but they have to sound like them, in the sense that the stucco has to reflect Jennifer's sound as she's saying that line. Okay, all this sort of stuff needs to sound like it. So they do a literal recreation. They bring in blankets, baffles, but they also build things. And he says he prefers to do this because when Jennifer or the actor comes back, whoever it is, comes back in and reads that line, she's going to be saying that line in the same space, and acoustically the same space, and it can affect how she'll say the line, which is a really interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing that he believes not only does the audience need to hear that new line as it sounds in the original space, but the actor needs to say the line so he can say it in the same space that they originally said it in. So he thinks it affects how the actor says the line. It's amazing. So, yep, I want the actor to be back in that same acoustic space they were when they originally said that line. There's nothing like the real thing. There's nothing like the real thing. That's what I want. So I know that sounds so elaborate, doesn't it? And that was my reaction. It's like, wow, I knew that, it was important to kind of capture the sound reflections of rooms. Yeah, I can understand you don't want a bedroom scene to sound like it's occurring in an airplane hangar. Those extreme examples have to be, certainly taken care of. I said, no, the listeners, the audience's ear is much more sensitive than you realize. This is where, don't you scientists know this? And I said, no. I do research on sound. I said, I don't think scientists have ever studied this sort of detail of how the brain is going to be reactive to, kind of reflected sound. I said, I don't think there's any this research that's been done on exactly that question. He says, no, Sandy, Jay, you talk to these folks, and this is true of everyone I talk to, that they're not just doing these really elaborate things for each other so they can win, Emmys or Oscars or whatever. They're doing it because they really believe the audience's ear is that sensitive, and that when we are if there's a mistake and there's not a good matchup, and he gives the example of using room tone recordings that very often they're not good enough, and you can get a sense that some of these telenovelas or soap operas are, just lower productions, because they don't have that in there. They don't have this elaborate kind of way of either re-recording the dialogue in the original space, doing something with computer to reshape the sound, or to actually recreate the acoustic space in the studio. We found this really interesting, so we decided just to do a little experiment on this because it hadn't been done before, but it's not going to seem that's strange, especially now that you've learned all this, that we can hear rooms. This is what we were interested in. And this is an experiment that was done right here on your campus. What we did is we made recordings of sounds in different rooms. And it was important that they be the same sounds. Okay, they were important that they be the same sounds in all the different rooms. So it's not like, we were recording the emitted sounds and say, this is actually showing a gymnasium, here's a bathroom. You can imagine the emitted sounds are going to be different. There's going to be, water running here and toilet flushing, but we didn't want that to give away the room. What we wanted to do is play sounds to a microphone where they were coming through a loudspeaker, and the sounds were always the same in each of the 4 rooms. Okay, and here you're seeing the 4 rooms. Bathroom, a classroom. The bathroom, by the way, is in the basement of Olmsted. This classroom is also in Olmsted. This is a laboratory room also in the basement of Olmsted. So our lab is in the basement of Olmsted. So, we wanted to do it as close as possible since we were bringing equipment in there. But we wanted also another room that was much different from these other 3 rooms. So we recorded in a gymnasium on campus. Here you're seeing this gymnasium in these 2 pictures. Now, you might not know this gymnasium. This is not the standard basketball courts that the team plays on. This is a secondary gymnasium that existed then. The fancy basketball court one didn't exist back when we did this experiment. Where this is near the Commons, this gymnasium, if you're interested. I'm not sure what they use it for anymore, but I think it's still there. So we took these 4 rooms and played lots of different sounds through the speakers, but they were the same sounds. Okay? And we also recorded it in a very interesting way. We recorded using a microphone system that I think you'll find very interesting. And I'll talk about more, maybe I think we're done with this. Maybe you did have a chance to talk about it in your sections yesterday. I don't know. It doesn't make a difference. I can just mention it here. It's a recording technique called binaural recordings. And there's different ways of doing this, but the way we did it, and I think one of the most accurate ways of doing it, is to put little microphones in the ear canals of a person. Okay, and that's what you're seeing here. We have a little microphone in a person's left ear and a little microphone in a person's right ear. This is very easy to do. You can buy these microphones these days, probably for $30 on Amazon or eBay or something like that. You can buy very expensive ones too, which they do for entertainment industry purposes, but I think I got ours for $50 back in the day. You put them in the person's ear canals. And what this does is it enables the recordings to capture stereo sound, right? Left-right sound, which you know about, but not just stereo sound, spatial sound that is also going to distinguish between front and back, up and down, and side to side. So if you record with these sort of microphones, these binaural 2-ear microphones, and then play these recordings to a person who's wearing headphones, that person will be able to hear the auditory space all around them. It's because we're recording it in the ears of a person, because these little ear flaps, they shape the sound. They shape the sound in a very subtle way so that things that are in front of a person are a tiny bit louder than things that are behind a person, okay? Because our ears face forward, right? They also are able to capture sounds that are above versus below, which regular stereo, just 2 channels, doesn't do very easily. And I've got a great example that I'll post for you on this. If you do a search for binaural recordings on the internet, you'll find some really, really cool examples of this, but I have one that's a lot of fun. It's of a haircut in a barber shop. And it was done with somebody wearing these little microphones in their ears, and you can hear the razor coming up to your head, and you can hear somebody speaking in front of you versus behind you, and someone's playing guitar as you're getting your hair cut. And it's a very compelling kind of way of listening to sound. It's very much like a virtual reality system for sound. If you have one of these, virtual headsets for gaming or something like that, you probably are listening to three-dimensional sound, although I imagine many of those situations are synthesized sound, not done with binaural recordings, which are probably great, but when you do it with these little microphones, it's very, very vivid. It captures sound wonderfully, which is exactly, it captures spatial sound wonderfully, which is exactly what we wanted to do for these experiments. It was important that we capture the detail of the spatial sounds in these rooms. So that's what we did. We played different sounds. So we played out of this loudspeaker, which was positioned in all these different rooms. Okay? You heard a recording of somebody reading a dialogue. You heard recordings of a computer-generated sound that sounded like a white noise. Okay, and then clicks and other things. Okay, what I have here is a little demonstration for you, and I'm not sure how well this will work. It depends if you're wearing earbuds. It depends if you've got high-quality earbuds on. But what I'm going to do is play a sound, 4 sounds from these different rooms, and I want you to listen to it. These sounds are going to be little noise bursts, like the ch. That's what it's going to sound like to you. But each of those noise bursts came out of a speaker that was positioned in a different room. So first you're going to hear those noise bursts from a recording that was in one of these rooms, and then you're going to hear noise bursts that were recorded in a different room, and then a noise burst in the other room, the final room. And I just want you to see if you can determine which was which. So I'll play them a few times. Which room was this sound recorded in? I'm going to play them all just once for you, and then I'll play them twice. Let me play it again. Which room was this recorded in? If you're wearing headbuds, this might work really well. Earbuds, this might work really well. Okay, here's another one. Here's a different room now. Play that again. Which one was it? Is this the bathroom? Is this the classroom, the gymnasium, or the little, that's a little lab room, like a little closet-sized lab room. Okay, here's another one. Is that the gymnasium, or is it the bathroom, or is it the classroom, or the little lab room? Kind of a walk-in closet-sized lab room. And here's the last one. Which room is that? Is that the bathroom, classroom, gym, walk-in closet, lab room? Let's play them again. Now that you know what the different sounds are, see if you can do this. Which room do you think that is? Versus this? Is that the bathroom, the classroom, gymnasium, or lab? Which one's this? Third sound, which room is this? And then, oh, here's one more. I'm just kidding. You know that. All right. So, which was which? If you're wearing headphones, okay, you might be able to do this. The answer, actually, I made very obvious. The first one that you heard was, in fact, the bathroom. Okay. The second one was the classroom. The third one was the gymnasium. And the fourth one was the little lab room. Okay, so they actually were in the order, kind of made it easy for you. But when we had our subjects come into our experiment, without having done anything like this before, and we showed them pictures just like we showed you, and then played the sounds for them, they were astonishingly great at it. Most people, here's the data, what you heard, actually, I believe, was this one right here. You heard the ch, which is right here. And you can see how good people were with this. They were, their chance performance would have been 25%. If they were just guessing, it would have been 25% correct most of the time. But look how good they are at this. With the bathroom, they're 78%. With the classroom, they're 82%. With the gymnasium, they're getting it about 92%. And with the small lab, they're again like 85% correct. So they're really, really, really good at this, which is really good. We were surprised at how good they were at this. If you were listening over your computer speakers, you might not have been able to do it very well, but all of our subjects were in headphones, and it really makes a difference because they were binaural recordings. So people are really, really good at this. So they're excellent. In fact, what we decided to do, because we didn't think they were going to be so great, is we decided to chop up the sound. And so what we did is we just took, okay, so we decided just to do it with we decided 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bursts on that sound. We just decided to do it with a single burst. Okay, we just decided to do it with a single like that to see if people could do it. And they, again, were almost as good. They only need to hear that one. They were like 70, 80, almost 90% correct. And then what we did is we took that single sound and we chopped off the initial sound. So the only thing they could hear were the echoes after the initial sound occurred. So they heard it sounded like, and it was just the echoes. And people weren't as great, but they were 60, 70% correct still. Much better than if they were just guessing. These were new subjects, of course. So with only a single echo from a single pulse, they were able to do this. And we were like really excited. This is like, Sandy and Jay and all those other guys who said that our brains are sensitive to how rooms structure sound are maybe right, because our brains need a very small portion of a sound to know something about the room in which the sound was recorded, just like Jay and Sandy had guessed. Okay. All right, this is a good place to take a little break, but let me see if there's any questions or concerns at this point, and then we'll take our 10-minute break. Anything? No problem. If you have any, we will come back and we can still talk about this. So let's go ahead and mute, and I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we are back, and I was able to get this little video demonstration going for you. Hopefully, it will work well. Let me share my screen for this video. It's one of your favorites, I'm sure. It's Mary Poppins, the original. Let's see if this works here. Uh-oh. Why is this not working? Oh, shoot. Hold on a sec. Why is this? Are you able to? It looks really good on my screen. Hold on. Why is this not open? Okay, hold on. Let me try this again. No one panic. It should work. I see it for a second, and then it disappears. Okay, let me, sorry about this, everybody. Hey, are you folks seeing it? Are you folks seeing a kind of a gray screen? It's gray. Okay, thank you. Gray screen. Thank you. Okay, let me try it again then. It worked fine. Okay, hold on. Let me, no, let me see that. Let me try it again. Okay, I think it's working. Let's see. Let's try sharing again. It shows up gray again. Shoot. It's making me cry. Still gray, huh? Let me see if I play it, what happens. Does it change back? I don't know how else to do this. Shoot, all right, I guess this isn't working, everybody. I apologize. I don't know why it's just showing gray. Hold on a second. Hey, I just saw it for a second, did you? Hold on a second. You know, I can play the sound for you, and maybe that'll be enough. A second. Share. One more time. I apologize. Okay. You know what I'll do? I'll play the sound anyway. So you're able to hear it okay, right? Could you let me know? Just give me a thumbs up or something if you're able to hear it when I play it. Okay. Oops, where's everybody? Sorry. Give me a thumbs up if you're able to hear it when I played it. No? Oh, yeah. Okay, so you could hear it. Good. Okay, let's just do that then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch. Works great if you can see it. I'm going to switch between the original English recording and then the dubbed. I think I can. Let's see what do we have here. Subtitles. I can play the French. I'll switch between English and French. Between English and French. And I think you'll hear not only the language change, but the space in which the dialogue is being spoken will change. Okay, that's what I'm after. If you could see the video, it would really help because you would see that when it was on English, that the audio space that you were hearing behind the dialogue matched what you were seeing. But I think you'll still hear a difference between the two.
Take a look. This, of course.
I can't even tell where I am.
Right, that ran away, not the...
Where is she?
What? Well, yes, she's in the nursery, of course. I mean, I put her to work straight away.
How?
Okay. Sorry about this, everybody. It's hard to do it without seeing it.
Paper, you see.
Here you
I
go.
thought that I...
You are George Banks, are you not?
What?
And you did advertise for a nanny, did you not?
George Banks.
Very well, then.
Here's the French.
Turned it over. Tore it up. Un petit morceau, je l'avais jeté.
Êtes-vous malade, monsieur?
Eh, j'espère que non.
Here's the English.
Parlons un peu de mes gages. L'annonce sur ce sujet est obscure.
Obscure.
Il va falloir écrire.
Clear on that point, mustn't we?
Yes, we must indeed.
I shall require every second Tuesday off.
Every Tuesday.
On second thoughts, I believe a trial period would be wise.
Je vous accorde 8 jours. D'ici là, je serai fixée.
Hopefully you're able to hear. I'm sorry about that.
Je vais aller voir les enfants. Merci.
Okay, sorry it didn't work out that well. But typically what people can hear, especially when they can see it, is that it's the English dialogue, they can hear that there's a space that matches the visual space that they're seeing. When it's the French dialogue, it doesn't sound right. And the reason is when they do the French dialogue, especially when they did it back then for this old movie, they wouldn't really kind of recreate the acoustic space at all. What they would do is they would just bring the French actor into the a sound booth that really has no sound reflections at all, and let them do the looping that way. And of course, it doesn't match up the lips very well. But in addition to that, they had no real concern. So that's what I think Sandy had suggested to me. So if you want to see a demonstration, look for an old movie that had been dubbed in another language. And not only will you hear a difference in the actual dialogue, of course, because it's French versus English, you'll hear a difference in the recorded space. Anyway, works much better when you can see the video. I apologize that it didn't work as well. Okay, let's stop. And now I can see the video, ironically enough. And I will share again. Where's our thing? Right there. Okay, there we go. Good. All right, so we've been through all this. All right, so we're going to go on to another issue that I talked to Jay and Sandy about when it comes to the recording and the redubbing of TV shows and movies. Hold on a second, let me make sure I have this. There we go. Okay, so what they said is not only are we sensitive to different rooms and the sound signatures of different rooms, which they have to be very concerned with when they're recording and redubbing, we're also sensitive to the positions in different rooms, because they said the sound signature of a room is such that it sounds different in different locations in that room. So if you look around the room you're in right now, as long as it's not a fish tank, you'll see that part of the room might have more soft surfaces. Maybe there's a hanging curtain or a couch on one side, or maybe if you're in your bedroom, there's a bed against the wall, and against another wall, there's a dresser and a mirror. If you were to record sounds in different portions of the room, you could imagine that the structure of the reflected sound would be different. Right? Yeah, the whole room is going to have a sound signature, but different locations have different signatures as well, which I thought was really, really interesting. By the way, if you're interested, I just realized, so I have been using this room also for doing some sound music recording and the music mixing and things like that as a hobby. And here are some of the baffles. Well, can you see this? Yeah, here are some of the baffles of the things that Jay or here, can you see that? Yeah, there you go, that sort of stuff. Jay or Sandy might use. So actually, as I'm looking around this room, not the fish tank, but I was looking down in the real room, I have that sort of baffle in one position in the room, and the other is a garage. Maybe someday, if you're nice to me, I'll show you what it really looks like in here. But this is a room that has very different sorts of sound reflections depending on where in the room you are standing, or in the room you would be recording from, which is something they have to consider very seriously. And one of the reasons they do is a phenomenon that Jay liked to call ambient shift. What's ambient shift? Oh, there's Jay, our friend Jay again. Ambient shift is a kind of a consequence of the fact that they still use a very particular microphone for recording dialogue, especially when it comes to TV shows. So he was giving me the example of him just having spent the day before I met with him doing some recording of that show Beyond, Without a Trace, that's what it's called. He said, Without a Trace, they use the standard sort of microphones. They put microphones all over a set when they're recording, but when it comes to dialogue, they still like to use the old style microphones that are kind of hanging from above, and then switch their position depending on, what do I have here I can use here? Switch the position depending on who's speaking. So it swings back and forth depending on if the person on the right speaking or the person on the left is speaking. It's called, okay, so here we go. It's a great example. And these are the actors that were on Without a Trace. Anthony LaPaglia and I can't remember her name. But it was a very popular show at the time. Shotgun microphones is what we're talking about. So I can actually use a real microphone, but this is not a shotgun microphone, but it will serve the purpose of what I'm trying to show here. Okay? This microphone right here. So basically, it would go, oh gosh, because I'm using the, yeah, I'm doing this way. So when the actress is talking, it might be pointing to her like this. When the actor is talking, it would be pointing at him like this. So it swings back and forth. And there's a lot of technical reasons they still use microphones like this. But it's called a shotgun microphone basically because it's pointing down towards one of the actors when they're talking. And the person who kind of controls this microphone has a little wheel. So they kind of switch the microphone's direction back and forth. Okay? And The reason Jay calls this ambient shift is not only are you capturing the line reading from a specific actor as it's pointing towards them, you're actually also, I'm just putting this down here so you can see this better. You're actually recording everything that is behind them, which hopefully isn't too much noise, but it is certainly room reflections. So you're recording behind the actress, and you're recording the actress, you're not only getting her dialogue, you're getting everything, the sound structure that's behind her. And then you're switching over to the actor, you're recording his dialogue now, and you're recording everything that's behind him. It goes back and forth as the scene occurs. And I should say, the guy that operates this is going to have the script right there with him, so he knows when to switch it back and forth. They get very, very good at this, and the dialogue is picked up pretty well most of the time. Okay, but this is where things get a little weird. Because the space behind the actors are necessarily going to be a little different, it could be the case that when it's pointed to the actress, okay, then it's going to sound like she's in a different room than when it's pointed to the actor. All right, so imagine, I think I talk about this in the book. We started reading about a bedroom scene. Two characters are standing kind of in the middle, but the actress is standing in front of the bed. The actor is standing in front of a wall that there's a mirror in it and a lot of hard furniture. As the microphone swinging back and forth, again, it's capturing one side of the room, which has kind of softer surfaces and are kind of dampen the sound. Or it swings again to the actor, it's going to have hard surfaces and it's going to have a lot more reflections. In theory, when it's swinging back and forth, yes, it will capture the dialogue of the two actors, but it also could make the actress sound like she's in a bedroom, and the actor who's in front of the hard surfaces sound like he's in a gymnasium or a bathroom or a hard surfaced room, right? So this is something they need to take care of. Every room is differently reflective in different areas. And if you've looked around your room right now, you can see that, right? You have soft surfaces, maybe more soft surfaces in one part of the room than another part of the room. And that's going to give each part of the room a different sound signature, which could be picked up with this microphone as it goes back and forth. Because the shotgun microphone will pick up the actor and what's behind them. Okay, it's designed not to pick up everything around, but the actor and what's behind them. That's also true of this microphone here to some degree. Okay, I'll take the front off here. It will do the same type of thing, but not as much as a shotgun microphone. A shotgun microphone will get a very narrow area. This gets a pretty narrow area because I use it for singing. But shotgun microphone is designed just to pick up the actor and also ends up picking up what's behind them. And for that reason, okay, shifting the mics back and forth like this can cause the actors to sound like they're in separate rooms, which can be a problem, right? As I said, the actress could sound like she's in the bedroom, the actor could sound like he's in a gymnasium. So what Jay has to do, besides giving the entire room a sound signature that looks like it should, given the set that you're seeing, he needs to equalize the reflections in the room within itself. Okay? He needs to make sure that the sound reflections on the left side of the room where the actress is and the right side of the room where the actor is sound more or less similar. Okay? Because that's not something that you want the microphone to pick up, again, he wants to avoid it sounding like the actors are in two very, very different spaces. So he does the same thing. He has to bring in blankets and try to equalize the sound reflections behind each of the actors when they're using a shotgun microphone like this, right? And as I said, they'll bring in things like this, much larger things like this that absorb sound in very specific ways. These can be designed to have, smaller ridges, larger ridges. It's going to be a harder surface, softer surface, that type of thing. Okay, so it gets very complicated. And again, this is why these folks, get paid what they do get paid, because it's like a craft, like an art almost. They have to know how to do this and do it very quickly as the camera folks are setting up and as the light folks are setting up. And when I talked to Jake about this again, I said, this is amazing. I had no idea you guys really paid attention to this detail. And he goes, oh yeah, I know it sounds sometimes like it's overkill, but in fact, we really truly believe that the human brain can detect these sorts of very subtle differences. They have a sense, our brains have a sense of how different areas of a room reflect and structure sound differently. I'm sure you guys know this, right? You're scientists. And I said, no, we do not know this, Jay. This is not the sort of thing that sound scientists typically study like this. This is so interesting. So again, we decided we had to do a little bit of our own research on this. So we did this crazy experiment. So in this experiment, what we did is we put subjects on a cart. You can see it right there. And we rolled them around to different positions in a very quiet classroom. In fact, this was a very old classroom, again in Olmsted, that we were able to shut the ventilation off completely. I don't think you can do this in the more modern rooms, but you actually could shut the ventilation off. So we made sure that there was no sound, very little sound, if any, noticeable sound coming from any static position in the room. Because what we wanted subjects to do is try to determine where they were in the room from sound reflections, not from sound that was emanating from a fan or emanating from ventilation. Okay. So we rolled them to different positions in the room and had them either say something or click. We had a little clicker. I don't know if you can see this down here. Where's our clicker? I can't remember. Maybe it's actually right where he's sitting. There's a little clicker he could push. But what we ended up using a lot were sounds coming out of a speaker, but that speaker was always at the same position relative to the listener. It didn't change its position at all. It was a sound source that moved around with the listener. And what we would do is blindfold them and then actually put headphones on them while we moved them around. We wanted to make sure they couldn't hear where they were going. We made them dizzy. Subjects actually thought it was perfectly fine to be blindfolded and spun around on a cart. And then we basically stopped them in one of these positions, either in the center of the room or in the front of the front and the middle of the room, front left, front right side, or the back of the room, by back right, back left, that sort of thing, and asked them to guess which of those 9 positions they were in by making sound and hearing how the room reflected that sound. Okay? You could imagine if you went into the corner of the room you're in right now and closed your eyes and said testing 1, 2 into that corner, it might sound different than if you were in the middle of the room. Okay, and we kind of banked on that being the case, right? So here's the idea. Based on room reflections itself, not the sound sources, right? We didn't want them to be able to say, oh, I hear the ventilation over there, so I must be on the right side of the room. We didn't want that. We wanted to turn that off and make sure that what they were able to do is determine the position of their room based on how that position in the room, in fact, reflected sound. So the sound source had to move with the listener. Either they were saying the sound, which obviously is with the listener, clicking, snapping their fingers, I think we let them do at one point, or the sound source came out of this. All right. So yeah, we have echolocation, clicker, and noise, the same noise burst that we had before, the ch-ch-ch, because that was a good sound for the previous experiment, and it worked well. And what we found is that they weren't as excellent at this task as they were at the room recognition task, the one that had the gymnasium and the bathroom. But they could do this, and they could do it at better than chance levels. Let me just move this here. What we have here are the 3 types of sounds. And This is the voice is in, I hope that's blue, I'm colorblind as you'll learn. If they are using their own voice and going testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2, they are well above chance at guessing whether they are in the center of the room or to the front and in the middle, or the middle left side, and that sort of thing. All of this, if they were chance, it'd be 1 out of 9, which is what, 12% correct or something like that. And as you can see, for the these blue lines here, they are what, 50, 60, 40, 50, 60%. Yeah, pretty much. So they could do this. They could do this at certainly better than chance levels, just like Jay Patterson had suggested. Yeah, not only can you recognize rooms, okay, but you can recognize where in a room you are based on how that part of the room reflects sounds. And let's make it very clear that this was a very, very kind of empty classroom. We took all the chairs and tables out of the classroom. So there was really, all the surfaces were, all the positions in the room were pretty, standard. It's not like we had a bed on one side of the room and a mirror on the other side of the room or something like that. We wanted to make this, challenging, but people could determine their position in the room based on how it reflected sound. So yeah, they can do this better than chance levels. Listeners are good at identifying their position based on the reflected sounds. Cool. Great idea for an experiment, Jay. Thank you for that. It was a fun one to do. By the way, the whole class isn't about research that we do in my laboratory. The first chapter is pretty much, then we'll talk about lots of other people's research, just so you think this isn't all the Rosenblum show. There is one more experiment I want to tell you about that we did. I think you'll find it interesting. It had to do with another observation, this one from our friend Sandy. He told us that when it comes to Foley recording, okay, that's the sound effects, that they still do some the old way, and they do it in a very particular space. So what does this mean? The old and new way of doing sound effects. You might know this. I should find a video for you folks about how they used to do sound effects back before there were computers. Universal Studios used to have a demonstration like this. I don't think they do anymore. I know the Warner Brothers tour doesn't do it. They just talk about the new way. So the new way, of course, is when they need to have a sound effect, they have this library of thousands and thousands of audio files on their computers, probably tens of thousands. They have probably 300 car crash sounds. They have probably 300 tire screeching sounds. So, when Tom Cruise is driving around Rome, being chased, and they turn a corner, they gotta say, okay, the best one, they probably try a whole bunch and say, this is the best one. Okay. That's great. It's a wonderful, easy way to add sound effects. They change the sounds a little bit. They still can modify the sounds with different sorts of reflections and stuff like that. That is the old way. But how did you do that in the old days, right? Or say when they started doing this, they sound effects, they would do it for radio shows back in the 20s and 30s, I believe, and they would do it live. They do it live. This is where you maybe have heard that to do horse hooves, they would take coconuts and kind of go like this on the ground to if the story involved a horse and it was being depicted in this radio play to make it sound like a horse was walking, they would use coconuts. They had lots of old kind of school ways of doing this. If they had humans walking like this, okay, they would actually record people with their footsteps walking on different surfaces. This is actually still done, and it's especially done with footsteps, I should mention. So I would imagine that even though Mission Impossible probably used a ton of computer based sound effects, motorcycles, tires screeching, and even things that were maybe inside, like what a bomb that's about to go off sounds like when it beeps, and all these sort of things. They do some recording at the site when they're doing the original filming, but they add a whole bunch, and they Sandy will tell you they have to add some sort of reflected sound to all these sounds too. But for something like Footsteps, I bet even that giant budget Mission Impossible movie I saw on Saturday did Footsteps this way. So imagine Tom Cruise is walking across the floor of this warehouse room in Paris during one of the pivotal scenes, the scene I've been discussing. To get his footsteps right, what they would do is bring a clip of him walking, a film clip of him walking into the sound studio, and then have a guy wearing the same type of shoes that Tom Cruise is wearing in the scene, walk and kind of synchronize his steps with Tom Cruise's steps. They do this because it turns out, I didn't know this, Sandy told me, that our ears are very sensitive to the sound of footsteps. They can try to record them when they're actually recording the scene. But if there's something not quite right, it doesn't sound very clear, very often they have to bring them back to the studio and redo it. And when they redo it, they have to do things very, very precisely when it comes to the environment. So that's why I say here, Foley recordings, these sound effect recordings, are done in carefully cluttered acoustic environments. So yeah, they still do footsteps even for big budget movies in this way. They don't have files on the computer for footsteps. You can imagine how difficult it would be to sync that up. They want to make sure that the footsteps are very good. So here what you're seeing is a person who's making a Foley recording of footsteps for this scene of people walking through a park, it looks like, maybe. Okay. You're seeing there's two people walking through a park. Maybe they're looking for clues about some sort of crime or something like that. But because they're stepping on leaves as they walk through the park, those leaves, or is it leaves or is it something different? Something that is going to crunch a little bit, have to be put on the ground in order to simulate that. Okay. Either it's leaves, sometimes to get a leaf sound, they put cereal down here because it's even a more kind of noticeable crunching sound. It's kind of interesting the way they do this. They'll use objects sometimes that kind of are almost exaggerations of how things really sound for various reasons. But they'll especially do this with footsteps. Okay? And he said this something very interesting. If, say, and here's a situation I'm trying to pick here. Imagine the camera is positioned here just on the other side of this lamppost that has kind of a big concrete bottom here, okay? And so it's here, and then imagine there's not a bunch of people, but it's Tom Cruise walking by this lamppost that's then being seen here. Not only is the visual going to be showing him behind the lamppost, the audio has to portray him, his footsteps as they would sound going behind a lamppost. So what he'll do as he's recording these new footsteps, he will have people actually not just stand in one place, but actually walk across the stage, and he'll put something there to sound like at one point the footsteps have gone behind an obstruction. They've gone behind a baffle. So he'll put a baffle up so he can capture the sound of Tom Cruise's footsteps going behind, say, a big lamppost. Because you could imagine for that brief amount of time, his footsteps are behind that object. It's going to sound a little muffled. We know when you cover up sound, it sounds muffled, even if it's for a very, very short time. So, okay, that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense, right? If you're, imagine, Tom Cruise closes a door and the camera's on the other side of the door. You don't see what's going on. You still might be able to hear what's going on the other side of the door. but it's going to sound quieter. Yeah, you would want the sound to reflect that. And he said, yeah, but it's much more precise than that. Your ears are much more sensitive than that. He said that the type of thing that's going to block the sound has to be a similar shape. In other words, back to this situation, if the camera's over here, okay, you seeing this okay? The camera's over here, filming this way, right, towards this kind of obstruction here. Tom Cruise's footsteps go behind the obstruction. It can't just be anything that is then added to the sound stage when they're recording these in, his studio. It has to be something that is generally the same shape and size as what's being seen. You can't just put something that's very short here in the sound studio and record it. It's got to be something that's at least pretty tall. Maybe not quite as tall as this, right? This is probably like 20 feet high or 15 feet high, but something that's certainly 8 to 10 feet high has to be put in there because he thinks the ear is sensitive to that as well. Another really impressive thing that they're so certain that our ears are ridiculously sensitive to how, obstructions in this case shape sound, that, yeah, it's got to be the right shape. And it kind of, again, initiated us to do some experiments like this. Can people hear something about objects that aren't making sound, but and aren't really reflecting sound in this case, but instead how they're covering up sound? So this does still have to do with, sound reflections, but this isn't going to be one of those things where we're hearing the reflections. Instead, the reflections are actually preventing us from hearing part of the sound. Okay, so we call this the hearing silent shapes set of experiments. It's kind of fun. So we're talking about sound occluding surfaces. And here's one of the first experiments we did. What we did here, let's just talk about the these big boards here. This other board, this grayish board here, is a different experiment, the second experiment we did. But with these big boards here, what we did is we decided to position them. They were big sound muffling boards, basically. They were kind of like this, except they were they had basically a big thick piece of drywall behind it, because we wanted these things to really kind of block the sound that were coming from a set of loudspeakers that would position behind those big boards. Okay, so imagine my mouth is a loudspeaker, and I've got a whole about how many do we have there? 6 or something like that. And they're going to be playing a sound. In this case, they're playing, actually, be interested, they're playing a recording of the cafeteria that's in the Commons, where where all those places are to buy food. What is there? Panda Express or whatever down there. We just wanted to get a kind of the sound, a familiar sound of people milling about. But when you record those sounds, play it over the speakers, it kind of does sound like you're there. You don't hear specific, very precise sounds. You kind of hear like a blah, 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 talking. We played these through these speakers here, and then we put these boards around. And if the boards are completely covered up, it's going to be a very muffled sound. If they're opened up, it's going to be a very clear sound. And what we did is we brought subjects in, okay, and told them what we actually let them see exactly what was going on at first. We told them that we're going to be moving these boards that are going to be covering up the sound sometimes, and other times they're not. But we're going to move them, in very small increments in a random way. And their job is to do this, is to tell us when those boards are positioned far enough apart, based on how they're covering up the sound, if they're positioned far enough apart that they would be able to fit through them. Okay, so sometimes the boards were, kind of, I can't really see this, but they were far enough apart that people would be able to walk through, and sometimes they were too close, so people couldn't walk through without having to turn their body and squeeze. But we said, don't do that. Don't imagine doing that. Just imagine being able to walk through naturally. Ignore the under for now. just as this experiment has to do with walking through boards. And then we blindfolded them and spun them around and changed the position of these boards. And then we had headphones on while we were spinning them around. We then put them in front of the boards, take the headphones off, play the cafeteria sounds through these speakers, and they would tell us, based on how these boards are covering up these speakers, do you believe you could fit through them? And as it turns out, people are outstanding at this. Okay? Subjects can judge the space between the edges of two boards very, very well, just based on how the boards covered up another sound. And that's very, consistent with what Sandy told us. People are not just good at hearing, room reflections and different positions in different rooms and all that stuff. They're good at knowing something about the positions of objects that are covering sounds. Okay? Also, just ignore these black things now. We can do the same exact type of experiment with a board that doesn't cover up the speakers sideways, but covers it up and down. We then ask people if the board was positioned in such a way that they could walk under it without having to duck their heads, and they're just as good. They're really terrific at saying the board is now in a position I could walk under. It's now in a position I couldn't walk under with having to duck. Okay, Sandy was absolutely right about his intuitions on this sort of thing. Sandy, of course, also said that the shape of the sound obstructions was very important too. So this is a slide that's talking about sound obstruction, sound occluders. Right? What about that? Can people distinguish between the shape of the thing that is covering up sounds? And so we did this experiment where we put speakers. Speakers were a little bit different orientation this time, as you can see back here. We had a few more than we did last time. Okay. And we then positioned different objects to obstruct the sound with different shapes. Here's a triangle. We also had a disc, big circle disc, and a square. And we told them that, they could, when they first walked in the laboratory room, they could see these three shapes laying on the ground. Say, we're going to put these three shapes up, and we're going to ask you to try to guess which is which. Okay? They don't make sound; they obstruct sound. Okay? People said, "There's just no way I'm going to be able to do this. This is very strange. I mean, I'll be able to tell what sound's coming from those speakers, cafeteria sounds again. But I'm not going to be able to tell the object that's covering up those speakers." And then we blindfolded them, spun them around, put headphones on them so they couldn't hear us changing the shapes and all that stuff, put them right in front of the board, took off their headphones, started playing the cafeteria sounds, and asked them to judge whether it was the triangle, the disc, or the square that was in front of them. And what we found was that people could do it. They weren't perfect. They were guessing sometimes, but they were about 50-60% of the time they were correct. Chance would have been 33% of the time, right? So they could do it. They could do it at better than chance levels. And we had a handful of listeners. I think we ran 25 subjects in this initial experiment. We had a handful of experiments, about 4 or 5 subjects in the experiment that were outstanding, 80 to 90% correct. We thought, oh my gosh, how are they able to do this? Because I couldn't do it that well. Okay. But they were like really, really good. So, and they were quick too. I mean, I remember seeing some of these folks. We take the headphones off of them, we put up the shape, position them in front of the shape, turn on the crowd sound, take the headphones off of them, and they'd say, triangle. Be like, within 5 seconds, they get it. Okay, again, square. They were like 90% correct. And so we were astonished. We were really worried that they were cheating somehow or something like that. But we interviewed them. And so why do you think you're so good at this? Very few subjects have been this good. What is it? All of them said the same thing. They had all done some sound engineering or sound, kind of balancing for some audio purpose. Like some of them were DJs, right, for parties, and they'd be, responsible for setting the loudspeakers up in the right place in the room. Okay, I don't know, maybe some of you folks are DJs. I know it's a kind of a fun hobby to have and extra money and stuff. It's kind of exciting. And folks that have that type of background in sound, even though they've never been asked to do this type of thing before, were able to do this wonderfully. Some folks said, oh yeah, I run the soundboard for my church. We have one of these churches where music is really, really important. There's some very fine musicians in this church, and there's a band, and the sound has to be really pleasant and really, very vivid. You got to hear the words because people are singing along. And so, yeah, it takes some practice for me to be able to make sure all areas of the church audience can hear the sound coming from this band well. And I have they have a soundboard, and they're somewhere in the middle of the theater, and they're making sure the drums aren't too loud and the vocals are loud enough and all that sort of stuff. And these folks also were outstanding at this task, which I think is just really, really interesting. I mean, what it suggests is with some practice, you can really fine tune some type of a skill like this, where you're hearing these nuances of reflected sound and obstructed sound, which is really interesting. Which gets me to the last lesson I think we're going to take from Hollywood today about all this stuff. Hollywood has taught us, all these folks I interviewed has taught us that the auditory brain really is sensitive to sound reflections, and how sound reflections are different for different rooms and different for different locations in different rooms, and then how those that type of structure is changed with things that obstruct sound, occlude sound, and the position of those things is important, and the shape can even be heard of sound obstructions. What they've also taught me, and taught science, I think, is that the human ear is actually getting better with these types of sounds. We're getting more sensitive to these characteristics. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, sound for movies and TV has generally gotten much better than it used to be. Okay? It's gotten much better. So even, you don't have a surround sound system at home, you're listening to those little speakers, tiny little speakers they have on the bottom of your flat screen TV. Even those speakers are better than what I grew up with. Okay. The sound I heard from, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those giant, cathode ray tube TVs, the really, thick ones that are deep and super heavy, not the flat screens. Even though they had, a lot of space to put good loudspeakers, the sounds were not good. What you're hearing through your speakers are much better. And what you're hearing in recorded music is generally better too. Now, you might be a big vinyl fan and you like listening to vinyl instead of streaming music, and I understand that. But I promise you, even if you're listening to new vinyl especially, right, you're hearing music much clearer than my little brain was when I was your age. Okay? So recording techniques over the last, say, 20 to 25 years have just gotten tremendous, and sound reproduction techniques have gotten absolutely tremendous. And I learned this partly from another sound designer I met, named Zoli Asaze, and he was a great person to talk to, because remember I said different genres of entertainment have different budgets to work with. He worked on a soap opera called Days of Our Lives, and when I interviewed him back in 2009, whatever it was the longest running soap opera on TV. I think it had been around for 50 some odd years at that point. Yeah, maybe. I don't know if it's on. If anyone knows if it's on, I mean, it might be. It's been, 10 or 12 years since I interviewed him, 13 years. I'm not sure if it's still on, but it was very, very, very popular. Now, remember, for these shows that are done, kind of very inexpensively, They, don't have much of a budget to work on, so they have to do things the best they can with what they have. So he gave me this really interesting story about how sound was affecting his listeners. And he said that back, I guess, in the early 2000s, they started using a new type of camera. I mean, this show had been on since the 50s or something. In the back of the early 2000s, they had a different type of a camera. It was a camera that could actually be controlled from the director's booth. So they didn't actually have to have guys sitting there with the camera and moving them around and stuff while they were filming the scene. All that could be done remotely. They had little remote controls in the director's booth, so the camera folks would sit in the director's booth with the director and move levers and stuff, and the cameras would electronically move along these kind of tracks and that sort of thing. Just made everything much easier and much more efficient. But in order to accommodate the new tracks and the cameras and all that stuff, they had to rearrange the sets so that they moved baffles. They had to move sound baffles. And they ended up having to do this in one of the most used sets they had. I guess it was a character called Bo, who had whose apartment was a much used set for the show. So a lot of scenes took place in his apartment. I don't know the show, so I can't give you much more detail than that. But they had to move around a lot of baffles in order to make room for these new camera pulleys and tracks and all that sort of stuff. And he said after they did that, after they brought in these new cameras and had to move around the baffles, they started getting letters, and it was letters. It was not emails, it was not texts, it was not phone calls, it was letters, snail mail letters written from longtime viewers, which were mostly people in their 80s, right, who had been watching this show forever and, would make time in their day to watch it. My Nana was exactly like this, and I think this was one of her favorites. She said, okay, now we can't talk anymore, it's time to watch my stories. And so we have to kind of sit there and watch them with her. And for like little kids, they were boring, but it meant a lot to her. She watched them very seriously, and she would have written a letter to the studio about this. She said, for some reason, Bo's apartment seems different. It seems like it's not the same place. It seems bigger or something like that. It just doesn't feel right. And they would make guesses that, maybe because of these new cameras, they weren't getting the exact angles they used to get, but they tried to recreate that perfectly. And then they realized what it was. It was the sound. And some of the women who wrote in, or the older people who wrote in, did say that it sounded different, but some didn't know what it was different. But they realized the sound had changed dramatically after they moved those baffles. And so again, it's kind of this issue of expertise. These are people who have been watching the show for 30, 40 years at least, and were really familiar with the set as it was portrayed on TV. TV sound was better probably at this point, but it was something that the expertise led these older people to be able to say something was wrong. And that's what's really interesting about these improvements in sound that your generation has grown up with, right? You are hearing sound, you are hearing recorded sound so much more vividly than I did when I was growing up. And this has to do with, movie theater sound, it has to do with home sound, and it has to do with recordings. Recordings are done much more precisely than they used to be. And this is especially true in music. And to understand that, I think this would be a good time to talk about the work of a gentleman there on the left, whose name is Yasuhisa Toyota. And he is an architectural acoustician, and probably one of the most successful architectural acousticians now in the world. He designed the interior acoustics for the Walt Disney Concert Hall in downtown Los Angeles. Now, I don't know if you've been there yet. If you get a chance to go, I would say absolutely go. Even if you're not a fan of classical music, by the way, they do have more than classical music in these theaters. What they'll do is they'll have some pop artists or rock artists maybe perform with some of the orchestra or something like that. They really want an audience. They're very good. This LA Philharmonic is very good at kind of broadening the type of music they're playing there. So take a look. I'm urging you just musically to take a look at their calendar to see if there's things you might like. Also, I think they have a very good discount for students. So if you get a chance, go there. It is one of the most impressive theaters in the world, and he designed it. In fact, he was so successful designing the interior of the Disney Hall that he then got hired to redesign the interior of some of the most well-known concert halls in the world. You know, the Sydney Opera House. That's, when you see pictures of Sydney, Australia, there's that concert hall that's right there on the bay that kind of look like waves. It's kind of iconic. You see it in the postcards and everything. That's the Sydney Opera House, and he redesigned that interior after he did Disney Hall, and supposedly it's an amazing place to now listen to music. But Disney Hall is something. I mean, it's very cool looking on the outside. You've probably seen pictures. The inside is very cool looking too, but how it sounds is just amazing. It's just tremendous. And I talked to him about this. I said, by the time I had interviewed him, I had already seen a couple of concerts down there. And I said, it is such an amazing place to listen to music. It is so clear. You feel like you're right there next to the instruments. And he said, well, that's exactly the point of how he designed the theater. So it sounds clear and close. And he said, that's what your ears expect now. Not the old ears, not how we expected sound, say, 20, 25 years ago, but now your ears expect closeness and clarity. Okay? Because that's what concert halls are competing against. So even if you have some concerns about streaming quality music, if you're a super audiophile and you like listening to vinyl, and I have friends like this who like listening to vinyl more than streaming music. I understand streaming music does compress music a little bit. It's still, and this is also true of new vinyl, it is still so much clearer than it used to be when I was growing up. And the other thing is, especially for classical music, but also for pop music, instruments are recorded with microphones that are very, very close to the musicians. So my dad used to listen to recordings. He loved listening to classical music and listened to it on a very expensive hi-fi system for those years back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And he'd listen to the best records. Most of those symphony orchestra records were recorded in symphony halls or studios that were very large. And they were recorded with very high quality microphones and recording equipment. But those microphones would typically be microphones that were hung from the ceiling, okay, and were not more than two, maybe four microphones total placed where the audience would be sitting. So we'll make it. Here's the orchestra. Okay, they're facing this way. Here's where the audience would be sitting. Right over here. Here's the audience. Then going about. Okay. The microphones would hang off from the ceiling. The audience wouldn't be there. They take the audience out typically, but the microphones would be hanging off here, and there'd be 2 or 4 of them, and they would record the orchestra. And don't get me wrong, it sounded great. It sounded full and powerful, and it was exciting to listen to music over a good stereo system back in the 70s and 80s, especially classical music, because they really cared about the quality of the sound. I listened to a lot of rock and stuff, but my dad would play these things loud in the living room, and it would be fun. It sounded good. We thought it sounded good. Now what happens is when they record classical music, yes, they have microphones there, but they also have a microphone positioned either on or right in front of the instruments. Each musician has a microphone right there. And that is mixed into the sound and then that is put onto the recordings of the records or CDs or streaming, music. So music is now recorded, especially for classical, right up against the instrument. And you can imagine how different that's going to sound. Yeah, it's going to sound full, rich, and powerful, but it's also going to sound very intimate. It's going to sound like you're very close to the musicians, which is a cool feeling. It really is. I mean, it's a feeling you get when you're listening to your pop music, I should say. This is something they do with pop music. In fact, depending on if it's dance music, whatever, they make sure that there is a component of the music that does sound close to you. It's sometimes done, through computational effects and that sort of thing. But certainly if they're using live instruments, like live drums or something like that, there is a microphone at each drum to make sure that there is that type of intimacy with the drum. Okay? So it's the same kind of approach whether you are listening to pop music or jazz or classical music. Mr. Toyota says that is what he is working towards in his theaters. So he came up, along with a few other acousticians, with a really unique design for theater. It's called the vineyard design. And what the vineyard design is a situation where actually the seats are all around the musician. So this is here. This is Disney. This is the interior of Disney Hall. Right here is where the musicians would sit, where the orchestra would sit. And you can see there are seats. Yeah, from where the photo is taken, there's certainly seats back there, back here. But there's also seats here, here, and actually there are seats behind the orchestra as well. They can see fine though. Usually, I've sat over here before, and you can see really well. But there's something else you should notice. Okay, the seats are at quite a incline here, okay, and they are tiered. So there's like a kind of a tier up here, or tier down there, over here and here, okay, and that's why it's called a vineyard design, by the way. So if you've been to a vineyard, the Napa Valley to wine taste or whatever, you might know this, that the vines, if the vineyard's on a hill, the vines are on kind of tiers. And that's actually very good for the watering and the sun and all that sort of stuff. So that's why this looks like that. And that's why it's called a vineyard design. The vineyard design does a number of things sound-wise. First of all, it makes each seat closer to the orchestra than if the seats were very flat and went way back. Okay, so that incline is good, because it gives a shorter distance between where an audience member is sitting and the orchestra. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the fact that there's tiers here and surfaces, okay, between the tiers also helps with the sound. So you see these walls here. These walls, you're just seeing two walls here, one here, one here. But these walls are actually all through the theater. And they are designed to be highly reflective, sound reflecting walls. Okay? And these surfaces here in front of the seats are also designed to be highly sound reflecting. And so what these surfaces do is it allows the sound to come to the audience, okay, a little bit more clear and a little louder. They're put in very precise places. Okay? You can't just put surfaces in random places and expect this to happen. You've got to kind of go through this, measure everything, go through computational models and all this fancy stuff, as he was telling me. But properly placed vertical walls, properly placed vertical surfaces that are hard, this kind of high incline of the seats, the tiers all help the sound become clear and intimate. Okay, there you can see, oh, this is great. I forgot I had this. This is another view. I don't know, I don't remember if this is Disney Hall or another one. I can't remember, but it is another one he designed if it's not Disney Hall. And you can see these walls are everywhere. And you can see the incline is pretty high here and here, okay? All these surfaces reflect sound in a way so that the audience's ears get amazing clarity. and what's called intimacy, which is the feeling that you're right next to the instrument. It's a weird thing when you first go in and listen to music. Because if, for example, you're listening to the orchestra, you can see, oh my gosh, this is so vivid. This is really beautiful. You know the sound is coming from down here, but sometimes, especially when you hear, say, a solo instrument, when most of the orchestra is quiet and you hear the oboe doing a kind of much louder and pronounced solo, it almost sounds like the oboe is coming from next to you, behind you. You kind of look around, and then you say, no, the oboe is down there. I can see they're standing up and they're playing their little oboe solo, but it sounds like it's coming from right next to you. It is amazing. I mean, it is such a strange feeling to feel so intimate with the instruments. And there is a tiny bit of amplification here, but very, very little. They mix a tiny bit of amplification. There are a couple of there's some speakers positioned in the theater, but 90% of this is coming directly from the orchestra. Now, something really interesting, this was in the reviews of the theater when it first opened. Not only are sounds from the orchestra clear, but sounds from the audience are clear too, regardless of where you're sitting. So if someone in the audience has a bit of a cough during the cold and flu season, okay, you hear that cough pretty clearly while you're listening to the orchestra. They realized this was a bit of a problem, right? So every sound in the theater is clear, not just the orchestra. So what they used to do, I don't know if they're still doing this, is during the cold and flu season, they would have cough drops in big bins in front of all the doors that led to the theater. So if you have a cold, it was a sign of it. If you have a cold or a cough, please take one of these so you don't interrupt your neighbors, which was great. You heard less coughing, but I can tell you from experience, you were able to hear people unwrapping their cough drops. I mean, that's how clear it was. It was less distracting than the kind of incessant coughing, but during a quiet passage, all of a sudden you hear like that. And it could have been somebody completely on the other side of the theater. But for the most part, it is just an absolutely amazing thing. And he believes it's because the new audience's ears and their auditory brain have just gotten used to this intimacy and clarity. He has to replicate that in all the theaters he designs. But it's a kind of, again, a real tribute to our brains that we can, kind of make out all this nuance. So just to sum up here, our lessons from research is that we are exquisitely sensitive to how rooms structure a sound. And we now know this from Sandy and Jay and all the trouble they go to in equalizing the sound so that it does sound like it looks, right? All the stuff they do, whether they're doing the initial recording or the looping. We're also sensitive to the sound of different room positions. And that's partly a kind of byproduct of this mic that swings back and forth and has a direction of different positions of the room. They have to compensate for that, both in the original recording and in the Foley and the looping as well. And we're sensitive to when and how sounds are obstructed. So certainly that's going to be the case with the footsteps and doing sound effects or recreation through the Foley. By the way, I should just mention, just so you don't forget this, Foley's named after just the person who started doing sound effects for old radio plays. That's his last name, Foley. So Foley artists have to absolutely create sound obstructions if they are portrayed in the film, if they have to record footsteps. And finally, we're getting more sensitive to these characteristics. Cool. That ends our discussion of reflected sound. And we will start talking about emitted sounds on Tuesday. Okay, have a good weekend.